Against Rwanda's Tutsi. Our guest and speaker this evening is Philip Gourevitch, a highly acclaimed journalist, author, and staff writer at The New Yorker. To sort of provide some brief background off the top, from the 6th of April 1994 onwards for 100 days, the extermination of the Tutsi in Rwanda was the policy and central organizing principle of a massive campaign of genocide. The low estimate is that 500,000 people were killed. The true number is likely closer to 1 million. 800,000 is the most commonly cited estimate. And in the name of the Hutu power ideology, hundreds of thousands more were maimed, raped, lost parents, partners, children, often before their very eyes. And the campaign was far faster than the Germans ever killed during the Holocaust, and Philip Gourevitch calls it the most unambiguous case of genocide since the Holocaust. So the book we'll be discussing for parts of the evening is the classic sort of general audience work on the subject. We wish to inform you that tomorrow we will be killed with our families, Stories from Rwanda, published in 1998 with FSG, and the German edition is titled Wir möchten Ihnen mitteilen, dass wir morgen mit unseren Familien umgebracht werden, Berichte aus Ruanda, published in 1999 with Berlin Verlag. So we wish to inform you combines vivid vignettes of Rwandans' accounts of the time before, during, and after the genocide, with adept synopses of world events, regional history. It covers the immediate Rwandan politics of the day and the way Rwanda and the regions of Central Africa and East Africa were seen from abroad and afar at the time. We wish to inform you has won many awards, including the George Polk Award for Foreign Reporting, and was named one of The Guardian's 100 greatest nonfiction books in 2011, and one of the 50 best nonfiction books of the past 25 years by Slate in 2019. Philip Gourevitch has also published A Cold Case about two 1970 murders in New York City, and The Ballad of Abu Ghraib, which is about the infamous abuse and torturing of Iraqi prisoners by American soldiers in 2003-2004. He was the editor of the Paris Review from 2005 to 10, and in 2023, Philip Gourevitch is set to release a highly anticipated second book on Rwanda called You Hide That You Hate Me, and I Hide That I Know, for which he's been returning to Rwanda regularly. So Philip, unfortunately, couldn't join us today in person, but we're very grateful that the organizers here at the festival have made a hybrid event possible, so please join me in welcoming Philip Gourevitch to Berlin nonetheless. Is Philip with us? There he is. All right. Hi, Philip.
Here I am. Sorry not to be.
To sort of lead into the book, I'd like to read a short passage from about the midpoint of the book, where you write, "Of course, if you're some kind of archaeologist who digs this book up in the distant future, 5 or 50 or 500 years from now, there's a chance that Rwanda will be a peaceful land of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You may be planning your next holiday there, and the stories you find in these pages will offer but a memorial backdrop." So today we're not 500 years or even 50 years away from 1994, but still sort of nearly 30 years. So this evening we have an hour together as archaeologists, as you write, for our conversation, plus 15 minutes afterwards for questions from the audience to join us in this sort of expedition. But I think that's kind of as far as I can take the image, the metaphor of us being archaeologists, because the book, unlike what you wrote then, it doesn't need to be dug up because it's really stood the test of time. And most importantly, it's not at all ancient history or the distant past. The genocide against Rwanda's Tutsi in 1994 is an immense topic. There's no way to cover it all in one evening, but in the next hour or so, I'd like to revisit some of the stories told in this classic book, discuss some of the recent developments relating to the genocide, debate general lessons in line with the evening's broader topic, and then finally to get a preview of your upcoming book and how you sort of went about reporting and writing it. So
Right.
to start things off, we wish to inform you that tomorrow we will be killed with our families. Stories from Rwanda is, if folks are sort of browsing the library or a bookstore, it's surely one of the more capturing titles they'll come across. And perhaps we could start things off with this the particular story from Rwanda behind that very evocative title. And it also turns out to be a story from Laredo, Texas, actually. So,
Thank you, Anton. And you can all hear me.
yes.
Yes. Okay. Good. Just to make sure, and thank you to the festival very much for having me take part and accommodating me when I wasn't able to travel right now. The title is a long title, and it comes from a particular village in Western Rwanda. There was a store. It's a line that was written in a letter from when at the beginning of the genocide in April of 1994. Tutsis, realizing that they were targeted for death en masse, began to, in many places, though not in all places, they sought refuge, often in churches or in public schools and offices, in town halls, sometimes in stadiums, and sometimes this would be with the encouragement of local authorities or priests, who are local authorities, of course, saying, come here, or steering them in one or another direction. And this was because this was not the first instance of ethnic violence, of organized state violence against the Tutsi in Rwanda. That had begun in the late 1950s at the time, and early 1960s at the time of decolonization. So maybe it's best if I wind back for a minute, give a little context, because a little bit the way that at the same time Bosnia in the 90s was being reported as ancient tribal hatreds, and it took a while for people to unravel that and realize that this wasn't some sort of genetic disposition of two groups that were defined like cats and dogs in cartoons, which is a little bit the way it sometimes gets described. I think it's best to go back a little and just say Rwanda was one of the last countries in Africa to be colonized. It was in fact colonized first by Germany. It was one of the last because it's at the very dead center of Central Africa geographically. It's a place that has no shorelines with the ocean. It's landlocked. It had always prided itself on being fairly impenetrable, not being prone to invasion, but if anything, sending out parties into neighboring areas. It wasn't exactly the country cohesively that it is now. It was a sort of set of different kingdoms in roughly the geographical place that Rwanda is, that had been increasingly consolidated by the end of the 19th century. And when it was entered by Count von Goetzen on an expedition in the 1890s, it was a time, the Germans arrived basically at just this time when there was a collapse in the succession. There was a succession struggle in the royal court. And these two different factions both tried to play this new power, which also came with firearms and other things, to their own advantages, which some later came to regret because it allowed an opening for colonialism. And there were many divisions in Rwandan life at that time. And Hutu and Tutsi were one of them, but trying to find exactly how that was understood, there are disputes about it because there wasn't an alphabet in Rwanda. There weren't written histories. The ones that were later written were written by people from different points of views that have to be unraveled. But it was hardly, the idea of ethnicity and race as such did not exist in Rwanda or most of Africa prior to the European arrival, and became a European race science, which, as we know, was a poison in Europe was also a poison that they brought with them as an organizing principle. What they saw were two groups of people. At least they saw many groups, but they sort of saw that the royal court and many of the people around it were Tutsi, and that they seemed on the whole to be taller and thinner and keep cattle, and the rest seemed to be these shorter, stouter peasant people whom they kind of saw as the masses. And the power was kept pretty limited. Germany had a small footprint in this part of its Eastern African holdings, and used this kind of local authority. They sort of delegated the authority to the court to oppress the others. At the same time, the church came in and was kind of a joint venture of the Catholic Church in colonizing Rwanda. And between them, they started to set up a little bit more of the understanding of race and ethnicity that then, when Germany, as you know much better than most of my American audience ever will know, Germany and Belgium fought like on the front again with trench warfare, much like you had in Flanders, they had in the border with Congo during World War I. And there were pitched battles, obviously, in the East as well. But after World War I, Rwanda was handed over as a protectorate to the Belgians. It became thereafter a French-speaking Belgian protectorate, but basically a Belgian colony, and a kind of Rwanda and Burundi, or Rwanda Urundi as it was called, became handed over. And the Belgians really hardened. They brought in scientists with calipers to measure noses and cranial capacities, and came up with a real imposition of a kind of racial, ethnic, so-called science to define Tutsi and Hutu, to make these into races, and to set this up as a structure whereby everybody had it on their identity card. It was patrilineal. It was defined who had access to education, power, jobs, and so forth, and basically created a kind of serf class out of Hutu, it destroyed a lot of the local variations where you had quite a bit of Hutu chieftaincies and so forth, and put the Tutsis in charge. And the Tutsis, did not question the idea that they were superior when they were told that they were superior. It's not as if they were great egalitarians who were forced into this. They went along with it, as most elites do when they're given that opportunity. And then at the time of independence, in the late 50s, as the movement across the continent was towards independence, the Belgians essentially mobilized with some Hutu intellectuals in switching sides and saying, we should leave this in the name of majority rule with the Hutu, because the Hutu were always the majority. They were 85% roughly to 15%. And this is very unusual in African and societies in general, where you have this extremely disproportionate two groups. In most African countries, you have multiple groups and nobody has a majority. You have the largest group or regional group or ethnic group or language group. But here, Rwandans were not technically ethnicities in the sense that they spoke the same language and intermarried and worshiped the same gods and lived intermingled. All of the categories by which, I once got out the Harvard Encyclopedia of Ethnicity, I think it's called, or Dictionary of Ethnicity. And at the front, it gives a kind of long checklist of all the different attributes by which groups are defined as distinct, and they don't apply. And so at this point, it became purely political. And as the Hutu took over, they took over not by getting rid of the ethnic model, but by using it as the sole justification for their power. And because within this 85% population, there were all kinds of political fragmentation. The way that the Hutu leadership at that time, which was in fact the ancestors of what we saw in '94, the Hutu power movement, basically consolidated the idea of ethnic strife was always presented as unifying the Hutu body politic in some way against a common enemy. We must not be divided amongst ourselves. We must beware of the insidious tiny minority who will somehow or other rob us of our rightful majority rule. And we as the majority, the only legitimate people in the country. It became much more exaggerated. So there was violence introduced, there were pogroms, the French papers and other European intellectuals would come and say, like in the 60s, this was the first real case of mass genocide that they had seen since World War II. And there were tens of thousands killed, hundreds of thousands fled into exile in neighboring countries. 94 comes after periods of better and worse conflict ethnically and long periods of kind of stability that was based on a quota system in which Tutsi had no access to a lot of education, jobs, military and political power. And from the mid-70s to the 90s, there was a military leader, dictator named Habyarimana, who was the president. And in 1990, a group of the children mostly of the refugees who'd fled in the 50s and 60s, who were in exile in rather difficult situations in Uganda and Congo, and chiefly in Uganda, but they were dispersed all around, including in Burundi, formed a movement called the Rwandan Patriotic Front and demanded the right to return and share power, and then launched a war, a military campaign anyway, that developed into a sort of grinding civil war. The response from Kigali was to attack the Tutsi. They fought the war a little bit in the north. The French came in and helped them fight the war in the north. They got Mobutu sent people from Zaire, now Congo. But above all, the propaganda immediately exploded with all of these well-developed themes that had been there since the 50s of these are the enemy, every one of them is aligned, they are sort of the snake in our midst, and we must reckon with them. And there had never been any accountability for killing Tutsis. There'd always been, in fact, promotion and so forth. And so you see a very rapid acceleration of propaganda and militarization and the development of youth and civilian militias, a mobilization towards a kind of, I mean, the language of final solution floated around in it, but the idea of a final reckoning, an ultimate reckoning, an apocalyptic reckoning. That came in April 94 with the killing of Habyarimana. The killers of Habyarimana, his plane was shot down on April 6th of 94, have never been identified, and there are disputes as to who it was, but there's a lot of, I mean, regardless of who it was, those who had prepared the genocide staged a coup and took over and implemented roadblocks and began the killing immediately, within hours. And the genocide then unfurled over about 100 days. And in many villages around the country, it seemed both to come from above and to rise up from the population there who had in some way internalized and were prepared for this. That was the case in Muganero in Western Rwanda, which is where the title story of this book comes from, where there were most of Rwanda was Catholic. It's the most Catholic country in all of Africa. But there were a lot of Protestant smaller groups, and there was a sizable Seventh-day Adventist community in Western Rwanda. And this was a Seventh-day Adventist community. And people went to the church, Tutsis from all around, and there was killing in the surrounding communities in those first days. And the pastor told them to come to the church. And his son, who was the local doctor, the pastor was named Ntakirutimana, which happens to mean nothing is greater than God. And his son was a doctor, and the two of them together sort of encouraged people to go there. And then gendarmes were brought in, and the place was surrounded, and the water and the electric were cut. And it became clear that the militia were coming to massacre them. And amongst those taking refuge were many of the priests who were Tutsi priests who belonged to this church. And they wrote a letter to their leader saying, "Dear Pastor Ntakirutimana, we wish to inform you that we have learned that tomorrow we will be killed with our families. And we ask you to intercede on our behalf in the way that Esther interceded on behalf of the Jews," referring back to the biblical story about Babylon, and that is, the Jews celebrated Purim. So in other words, making a real spiritual, religious, old textual appeal to him. And by all accounts that I was able to collect when I arrived in Rwanda in 95, a year after the killing, the answer that he'd given was, God has already decided you must die. And the mass killing began the next day at that church, and it was a very typical story in this respect. These church refuges became the great massacre sites. The stadiums and the schools were where people sought refuge en masse were almost entirely became a bloodbath, and they became like the camps where they were killed. And then while I was reporting this, I learned that Pastor Ntakirutimana had wound up in Laredo, Texas. And in a way, I guess that's why I focused on his story a little bit. I was curious, like, who is this guy who winds up in America? Well, it turned out he had another son who had settled in America many years before, was not implicated in the genocide, who took him in as one would. And he was now under investigation from the International Tribunal for Rwanda. He was not a major leader of the genocide, but he was somebody who represented this kind of international networks of escape and of privilege that many of the leaders did have at their access as they fled. And one of the great questions that loomed over Rwanda after the genocide was, when you have this kind of killing in almost every community, and then you have the country taken over by the RPF, which brought the genocide to an end, and you had several million people fled, most of them on foot into Congo, Tanzania, Burundi, seeking to escape what they assumed would happen. And how do you have accountability? And that was really where this story came about. I went to Laredo, tracked this pastor down just before, as it turned out, he was arrested. And he decided that he wanted to tell his story. He actually had an American lawyer who said, "What, are you crazy? You know, don't talk to a reporter." And he said, no, my honor is perfect. I'm fine. And he came to meet me in his son's living room, carrying a little folder in his hands. And when I said to him at some point, you know, I heard when I was in your town a few weeks back in Rwanda, and now I've come to find you in Laredo, Texas, I heard that there was this letter that was written to you. And he said, yes, there was. And he pulled it out. He pulled out a photocopy of it, the handwritten letter, and a translation that he had made of it. And he thought of it as something that exonerated him, this plea, because it showed that they trusted him. And that's true. It did show that they trusted him, but it also showed that he'd betrayed their trust.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that, the overview of the sort of Rwandan history and then the specifics of this particular story. Moving from the specific story to the more general, I have sort of a follow-up question. At one point in the book, you write that genocide, after all, is an exercise in community building. Perhaps you could elaborate on that thesis a bit, sort of as you researched it for the Rwandan context, and elaborate on what was called the logic of genocide at the time.
Well, I mean, the line that genocide is an exercise in community building is, of course, contrary to one's reflexive sense, which is that it's an exercise in extermination, and that is about community destruction, and that it is just a bloody slaughter. And I was, of course, looking at this country and thinking, well, wait, people have done this here, they've done it elsewhere. They don't do it thinking, I'm going to go do something horrible only. There must be some appeal. What is the appeal in it? What is the mobilization? What is the logic by which you encourage and the leadership sort of makes that appeal? There's fear, there are all kinds of things, but it is about unifying one Volk against another, right? I mean, the German word is Volkesmord, and that I think is very good because it focuses on the fact that which genocide, most of us don't know enough Latin to really put it together, right?
Or Greek.
Right. It's very direct. It's the idea that you're taking a people or a collection of people who are identified as a people, and you're going to murder them like a person. You're going to put it to death like a person. The people become irrelevant. It's kind of an impersonal crime, even though it's almost always affects people highly personally, and the stories that come out of it are highly different one from the next. But it is the kind of industrial effort to eliminate a people, but to bring another people together in the process. And in Rwanda's case, you didn't have, I mean, there was a lot of discussion after the Holocaust sort of about how the Holocaust was, among other things, an expression or an act made possible by modern technology, right? From trains and schedule keeping and to the gas and everything else. That it was a kind of aspect of World War II. The atom bomb was another one that was like technology gone all evil. And there was this, I feel like Rwanda kind of disproved that as the necessary ingredient, because in Rwanda, they didn't have the technology. What they had were the people. And they were able to mobilize the people to do this more or less by hand. Most of the killing was done in Rwanda by groups. Very few cases where you hear about somebody killing individually. People were killed individually. They were hunted, but they were hunted by groups. And it was done by hand, using the basic tools of household life in a peasant society: machetes, clubs, pruning hooks, hose, a lot of hose, and at very close quarters, very intimately, very much in public in the communities. You didn't have the removal. Even in many other places, you don't necessarily send people to other countries like they did in Europe, but you have, like in Cambodia, the killing fields. You have ways that people who are involved in the killing can also disguise themselves. They wear a uniform. They're not, even if they're killing their neighbor may not recognize that it's them. Here, it was done explicitly to destroy the fabric of that, but in the process, to implicate everybody. That's the logic of genocide. And it's one that people really understand. You won't be punished. Killing is not a crime in a time of genocide. The killing that takes place in a genocide is the opposite. It is the law of that time.
To sort of switch gears slightly, moving from the sort of how people were murdered en masse, and moving into sort of the recent developments that I had mentioned earlier on, a sort of high-profile recent development was the arrest of Félicien Kabuga in May 2020, who was sort of a business tycoon in Rwanda, and he was allegedly the chief financier of the genocide. Most infamously, maybe he was the board of the radio propaganda station, RTLM, and he was detained in France after 26 years on the run in 2020, and he's now awaiting trial in The Hague. So this was a big story. In Germany, it made the 8 o'clock news in May 2020. I don't know if some folks in the audience maybe remember that. It was a kind of a surprising arrest. He was arguably the most wanted man in international criminal law at the time. Very elusive. He sort of spectacularly fled Rwanda in '94, went to Switzerland, emptied his bank accounts there. He was treated in outside of Frankfurt am Main here in Germany under a Tanzanian passport, and sort of there's a whole trail there. But he was detained in 2020. He himself is not mentioned directly in the book, but it covers the dynamics within this sort of elite circle of folks who prepared the genocide quite well, and Félicien Kabuga was a central member of that circle. So I sort of have a couple of questions there. How was he able to evade arrest for 26 years? More generally, you already got into this a bit earlier, sort of how did these elite Hutu genocidaires flee and hide, many of them for quite a long time? And then maybe more importantly or more interestingly, how was the arrest in 2020 received in Rwanda among the folks that you've been visiting regularly sort of since 1995?
So, first of all, yeah, it's true. I've not reported specifically on Kabuga or the arrest. I followed it. I read an excellent piece by Josh Hammer, an American reporter who actually lives in Berlin, but who wrote it, I think, for GQ, that sort of looked at the whole investigation in its final, stage where they closed in on him. I mean, it's not so different from the way that these fugitives often work. The richest ones seem to be the richest and the most aware of their criminality. In other words, they know right away that they've got to really hide. Some of them played a more political public role when they went into exile. So you had literally a genocidal government in exile. The government that presided between the assassination of the president over the extermination of the Tutsi during those 100 days, and then was pushed out by the Rwandan Patriotic Front when it took control in July of '94. Many of them fled to Congo, to Zaire, where Mobutu and the French government, which was a major patron of the genocidal regime and a big backer throughout the genocide, before, during, and after, really, sort of accepted and accommodated them. And they set themselves up kind of openly as that. And then it became kind of clear to them after, not quickly enough, but they started to realize that this was actually not working out well for them, that they were being investigated, that they were being exposed, there was an attempt to sort of put in a new category of people who were kind of their puppets, like the people who weren't known as big genocidaires, and they often fled further. So you have pockets of them. There were some that wound up getting caught in the Comoros. You had others who had a lot of connections with the church. The church, as it did after World War II, ran rat lines to save their protected priests, as they do to this day when they molest people. The church is an excellent organization if you're a criminal fugitive affiliated with it, in protecting you. You have genocidal priests from Rwanda giving communion to parishioners in the Provence right now, or at least until pretty recently. You had them in England, in Italy, and Switzerland. A few of them eventually would get turned over or captured in some way, but many of them would sort of get scrubbed into some kind of hiding that way. So you have these international networks. Elites often do. They also had money, and for a while the money didn't run out right away. They left Rwanda literally with empty treasury, everything they took with them, and many of them already had money, as you say, in Swiss bank accounts or so forth. Some of them had political and military kind of connections around the continent, and some of them were of use that way. They were willing to do nefarious things, and they worked with Mobutu. They fought for Mobutu. They continue to fight to this day in Congo. There's a big FDLR presence there, but in various iterations before it became called the FDLR, between 1995 and say 2000, I think it was 3 when they all became called FDLR. There was RDR first, which was a political movement that was basically their front movement, and then Alir. They had these different names, but they were the ones who fought for Mobutu. They're the ones who later fought for Kabila, who overthrew Mobutu when he turned against Rwanda and to some extent against Uganda. And many of them wound up in Angola, moving through, and then in Zambia there was a collection of them, and it became it also became a competition where Rwanda didn't have the standing or the capacity or any of the means to go after them at that point. But they put relentless pressure on the international community to try to produce these people with modest success. Meanwhile, the international system set up the tribunal through The Hague, but the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, which is kind of the sibling of the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia, they set it up in Arusha, Tanzania, and it, over a decade and a half with enormous budgets, managed to sort of capture and account for several dozen cases of mostly pretty high political figures, but not only, like people like this pastor or like the mayor in the town that I keep going back to, who are really non-entities, but fit into the hierarchy and fell into their hands and allowed them to use them for test cases. And then a lot of people lost interest. I mean, keeping the pressure on over time, the general rule in any kind of criminal operation is the longer you stay a fugitive, the better your chances are that people have not only lost track, but that they've lost institutional backing to put you down. And you also never surface. Kabuga really stayed very, very, very low key.
They ended up getting him because they were tracking his relatives, whom they knew that they were his relatives, their phones during COVID. It was in May 2020, so any movement was kind of a good, people weren't just going about their daily lives as they would regularly, and so it was fairly straightforward to track their phones. They kept going to this, one apartment where it seemed like an older, gentleman was living, and that's how they ended up deciding that they were gonna enter that apartment and arrest him.
And that's often the case. I mean, in all detective work, going after the family, but the family is pretty skillful too.
Yeah.
And so there are fewer and fewer of these people, and they've kept after them. And Rwanda has often sought to extradite them as well, and put pressure on other African governments more successfully, but more recently also on some of the European governments not to sort of treat it as expired. And some people say, well, I mean, enough is enough. What are you going to hunt these people forever? And the Rwandans are like, why should they be rewarded for having avoided us so far by getting away with it forever? It doesn't really seem like the fact that they got away with it without being caught is a good reason to leave them alone.
Yeah. Speaking to a German audience, I think that resonates quite well. And another sort of recent development, this is again a different topic, and it's directly related to your book. A story that was first told in We Wish to Inform You, and you can sort of correct me if I'm giving any of this sort of incorrectly, was that of Paul Rusesabagina, the hotel manager whose somewhat sort of fictionalized Hollywood portrayal in the movie Hotel Rwanda is probably a reference for a lot of folks in the audience, but you were not involved in. The sort of Hollywood account is perhaps kind of unsurprising. It's off by a bit, but you can, you know more about that than I do. But as you write, only very few folks in 1994 chose to act in the way that Paul Rusesabagina did, certainly saving sort of many lives. Over the years, living in the U.S., Rusesabagina has become increasingly critical of the Rwandan government under President Paul Kagame. And in 2020, as some might recall in the audience, he was brought to Rwanda under sort of a guise, arrested and brought to Rwanda and then arrested in what Paul Kagame called a flawless operation. He was given sort of a quick trial on terrorism charges and then sentenced to 25 years in prison. Very recently, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken raised some concerns about sort of the trial, the way that he was detained, the legal protections afforded to him. And the background to this, the proceedings were basically that in 2018, Rusesabagina was elected the head of a coalition, a group of sort of opposition groups in exile, Rwandan opposition groups. And this coalition has an armed wing that staged deadly attacks in Rwanda in 2019. And Rusesabagina himself has been shown at sort of a very minimum to have had contacts with some very unsavory characters, some folks with the FDLR militia whom you mentioned briefly. There were some trials here in Germany against those folks in Stuttgart. Some German journalists, Dominic Johnson, Simone Schlindwein, Bianca Schmolz, have done fantastic work on those trials. And some of the evidence that was used in Rwanda was provided by the Belgian authorities. So sort of a recent sort of dramatic development from many perspectives, I guess. And you've obviously followed him for a long time. What do you make of these developments of the trial, of sort of his activities and this recent turn of events?
I mean, I have followed them as a newspaper reader mostly. I have not reported on him in a very long time, since the late 90s when I came across his story there, because some of the stories of people that I was meeting in Kigali converged on the hotel. And in several of their cases, they mentioned that this guy Paul, who was managing the hotel at the time, had sent out a soldier or so to help bring them in. And the hotel was protected not by him. I mean, he, at the time at least, was quite prepared to accept the idea that he did not save lives. he ran interference a little bit, but mostly it was protected by the UN and by its international aura and by international attention. It was sort of like the elite hotel in the center of town, and they had some contact with the outside world. But he helped bring in some people who would very likely have been killed, who think they would have been killed, and there's no reason to dispute that. And he ran some kind of interference by cutting deals with by being sort of a drinking buddy and an accommodating character with Hutu power leaders. But they were saved ultimately by the RPF negotiating with the UN and Hutu power to get them out and cross the lines, including him. He was saved by them. And he then stayed in Rwanda immediately afterwards and was back to managing the hotel he had managed before, which is where I met him, a sister hotel. And he later left, and I don't know what all went on. There was a sense that there'd been some business bad blood between him and maybe some of the new people, but I'm not really sure. And he was not explicit about it, and it didn't become one of our themes. And he continued he was not known as a critic of or a political person at all. He was a hotel manager who emerged, and I don't think he was himself a Hutu extremist at the time. And he emerged, by the time the movie came out, he was still going to go to Kigali. It was really only in 2004, 5, 6 that he started to build a platform, increasingly as using his Hollywood-hyped idea as a hero of the genocide to kind of downplay, deny, and get into kind of Hutu power genocide politics in exile. Now, Rwanda's full of people who've turned 180 degrees one way or the other. Many of the people who took part in the genocide, especially amongst the elites, but not only, in the villages as well, were people who were very trusted by their neighbors up until very shortly before. Some of them became politically captured by the system. Some of them became pure opportunists. Others, it's not totally clear always how that shift took place, but it was not an uncommon thing. And it's not that uncommon in exile, where your community becomes this community, and there are business deals going on. He had a taxi company in Zambia. He had mineral exploration businesses that seemed to have been dabbling in. And he played both ends of this against the middle. So he could sort of play, well, I'm just a human rightsy Kagame critic here in Washington, or when I go to Washington to speak to people. But he would give these speeches that started to get on everybody's radar as like pretty problematic stuff. And then he started to pop up visiting the FDLR, running these, getting allied with militant exile groups, which you can argue about how much of a direct threat they were to an existential level to the Rwandan order, but no country takes that stuff lightly. You have armed people who are, trying to overthrow your government or just at least create terrorist trouble. And by 2018, that's what he did. He was saying, by any means necessary, we must overthrow it. He sent money. He did this and that. There was a FBI investigation at least 10 years ago. And it was very hard. It was almost, they're the FBI. They didn't tell me what they were doing. I learned that they were doing it, but they were not talking. And it got shut down at some point, and I don't know what happened. But obviously, they produced some stuff, and they did it in cooperation with the Rwandans. At some level, and the Belgians did too, extensively. And there was not a lot of ambiguity about that. So the real question seemed to be, the controversy the serious one, seems to be about how one sees his arrest, which is that under international law, the kind of, when somebody voluntarily enters into a situation that turns out to be a trap, that's like not as clearly okay as it is in here. For instance, if the FBI did this, they'd also call it a perfect operation. If they said, hey, we're sending a plane to pick you up to go see your friends that you're planning this mischief with, and you get in it and you find out that you're being flown instead to a federal military base to be taken into custody, everybody would say, well, that was a pretty choice operation, and it's legal in the United States. It's legal for drug deals. It's legal in a lot of ways. Sometimes it's quite ugly, and it's not always something that you want to cheer for at all. But it's something that people do. In international law, that happens differently. So I would just say that that's one of the controversies. The trial was not that quick. It was pretty detailed. You can argue about whether or not it was adequate and how it was done. He chose not to participate, which is always a sharp move for later being able to criticize it. But the question of guilt is not one that I've heard a single critic take up meaningfully. They avoid it studiously. So that is the controversy. Like, sort of, does guilt matter or does procedure matter? And how does that play out? And then there's a whole propaganda system around him that doesn't want any of these questions raised.
Thank you very much for sharing that and those insights, sort of updating, one of the central stories of the book, and the very sort of dramatic developments surrounding it. So, moving more generally to the theme of lessons, which is the title of the evening, André Sibomana, who was the editor of a very notable newspaper Kinyamateka and co-founder of several significant Rwandan human rights organizations before 1994, he observed the following in August 1996, following a visit to Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, sort of the central Holocaust memorial there. And in a passage, he compares the Holocaust and the genocide against Rwanda's Tutsi in the following way. I'll briefly read it out. The third fundamental difference between the two genocides relates to chronology. One took place 50 years ago, the other in 1994. Between these two dates, genocide was declared unlawful, treaties were signed, courts were invented, institutions were created. The world was rebuilt around the notion of genocide for the purpose of preserving its humanity. And yet, genocide took place in Rwanda. It took place before your eyes, thanks to the television crews. How is that possible? We have to admit that intervention mechanisms are still not adequate. Everyone knew from the beginning that a genocide was underway. There is an obligation to assist a people whose survival is at risk. What was done? It is as if we learn nothing from history. So he said that, he wrote that in 1996, and kind of very similarly, one of the sort of impetus for you writing the book in this context was you describe in the book the opening of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in '93, sort of Schindler's List. The movie was released in 1993 as well, and you describe sort of a never again moment in the U.S. At the time. So Sibomana was talking about lessons and sort of institutional reforms coming out of the Holocaust after 1945. The genocide in Rwanda now has also, it ended up sparking a great deal of sort of debates, reforms, conceptual debates and so on surrounding the International Criminal Court, the responsibility to protect a more robust UN peacekeeping mandates and so on. And I'd like to get your view on, so these kind of post-1994 reforms have now been in place for quite a while. They're not completely novel institutions and sort of doctrines anymore. And I'd like to ask what your assessment of those reforms is and sort of their track record up until now.
I guess I would say better to ask the Uyghurs or the Rohingya. I would say that the lesson of Rwanda is that people who depend on the international community for their protection are unprotected. And that's been the consistent lesson of history. There are times where we on the outside step up to and at some level are responding in a way that could at least be slightly compatible with our rhetoric. But the statement "never again" was a Jewish response to the Holocaust. It was essentially a slogan or a statement that came up during the Six-Day War in 1968 in Israel and coincided with that in the Eichmann trial, and was the idea: never again shall we be led like lambs to the slaughter. We will defend ourselves rather than depend on others to fail to defend us. And that became generalized into an anti-genocide slogan for a number of reasons, with not like against the wishes of the Jewish proponents of that idea either, I would think, but it was then generalized into this kind of slogan. But when I was writing about it in the early 90s, I was writing about the gap, the very big gap between the rhetoric and the reality. When Bill Clinton inaugurated this huge Holocaust Memorial Museum on the Mall in Washington and made that story of European history into a national American monument on our Hall of Monuments, which was kind of a wild move. He stood there with Elie Wiesel next to him, making speeches about how this is sort of is a constant reminder to live up to never allowing it again. And it was happening, that was right at that point, Serbian tanks were overrunning Srebrenica. It's not the Srebrenica chapter that people remember from the massacre. It was the first attack on Srebrenica in 93. It was going on. So when Rwanda occurred, America led the withdrawal of international action, discouraging others to act as well. And the actions that were taken, at one point there was the idea that there would be an African force that would intervene, and that we, the United States and some of our allies, would supply materiel, mostly, and they ended up negotiating for like a month about spare parts contracts and who was going to pay them for armored personnel carriers. As we know, if we want to act, we can act fast. 30 years before, when there was the Congo crisis in the 60s, they were able to deploy into that area in much less technologically advanced times at a very rapid speed. And now you couldn't get armored personnel carriers off the runways in German bases where Americans had them to Kigali, because you were haggling over this while tens of thousands were being killed a day. I mean, it was clear that there was no will and that nobody took it seriously. And frankly, these conventions, when people wrote the refugee conventions and the genocide convention and the major humanitarian and international law conventions, after World War II, the world was still colonized. Nobody was thinking about that part of the world. Nobody wanted to take responsibility for it. And if it's not strong, it gets abandoned. You got into so there's a different response when it's in Bosnia, because that's a NATO problem, but it's not. And then it becomes about NATO and about Europe and about those alliances, which is not incomprehensible. It's very comprehensible. Same thing in Ukraine. You have a genocidal war being waged by Putin against Ukraine right now. And guess what? We're not intervening by sending in our militaries, but we are fighting that war with them at a very high level of engagement, and increasingly openly and necessarily. So I think that that's the lessons of this, the R2P, the responsibility to protect, these are nice ideas. But the only time R2P was really invoked on the international scale was like to prevent the alleged slaughter in Libya under Gaddafi that then led to the slaughter of Gaddafi. And I don't think that war is really very fondly remembered by anybody as a great humanitarian intervention. And overall, we have not been able to respond to what's gone on in Syria. We've not been able to respond to a lot of things. And if anything, I think there's a pulling back from that on the level of the great powers. Yes, at the time, there were many people who said, like the quote that you read, now really the world must deliver. And I think there were others who drew the conclusion, now really we're on our own and we need to strengthen ourselves locally. When you had East Timor happen, even in the late 90s, it was a regional coalition again. It was Australia that led it. But if you have it happen in a place where there isn't that kind of a major power that can sort of master the whole logistics and everything else of that kind of an operation, it becomes much more piecemeal and much more complex. Rwanda, ironically, and I'm sure this was not what Sibomana had in mind, but Rwanda under the RPF has become one of the major providers of peacekeeping forces to the United Nations around the world. You've had them notably in Darfur and in the Central African Republic, but not only, and in other places. And they've gone to Mozambique as an intervention force, and they've been doing police work in Haiti and so forth. Partly, I think, based on their own experience, and partly based on the fact that this is there's this demand out there for which they're prepared to meet the supply.
Yeah, thank you. So when we talked earlier, you contrasted sort of your views and the sort of lessons from your book with the work and the book that Samantha Power ended up publishing in the mid 2000s, which I thought was an interesting way to, like, an interesting comparison. I have one sort of brief question, and then some folks in the audience can already sort of start thinking about whether they'd like to ask Philip something. So a great deal has been written about the genocidaire and the violence, both about the sort of elite circle of masterminds, such as Kabuga, whom we covered, and ordinary Hutu who decided to kill their neighbors. Liane Fuji has done terrific work on that topic. But you write in the book, the more the dead pile up, the more the killers become the focus. The dead only of interest as evidence. Yet turn the tables, and it's clear that there is greater cause for celebration when 2 lives are saved instead of 1. There are many, many very remarkable survivor accounts, including remarkable books in French, in German, and English by Esther Mujavayo and Judith Kayitesi very recently, just to mention 2. And you've been going back to Rwanda regularly over the past years, visiting the same folks in the same village for sort of a multi-generational account of how Rwandans now are living together, survivors and perpetrators as neighbors. The upcoming book in September 2023 is You Hide That You Hate Me and I Hide That I Know, which is another very evocative title. Perhaps again, using the title, you could give us a short preview of that book, whether you consider it sort of a sequel to We Wish to Inform You, or sort of what the concept is and how you went about reporting and writing that book. So sort of briefly, and then we'll open up the floor. We have like another 10, 15 minutes.
Briefly, whether it's a sequel or not, how it's treated that way is, yes, it follows some of the threads that I picked up there, but it's by no means sort of a continuation of that book and its concerns specifically. It's really looking at something else. It's looking at, we talked a little bit about these international fugitives who got away, but the great majority of Rwandans were, by 1996, living back in Rwanda. The camps had been disbanded in Tanzania and in Burundi, and in Congo they were broken up. Rwanda went into Congo with military force and drove the great majority of the people in those camps home, and the vast majority of Rwandans were living inside Rwanda, and amongst them, of course, hundreds of thousands of people implicated in the genocide. And the question was, how do you reckon with that? How do you actually start to, there was an expression that was used in Eastern Europe after communism, it's easy to make fish soup out of an aquarium, but it's not clear how you make an aquarium out of fish soup. And in Rwanda, that was the problem too. How do you take a totally destroyed and torn social fabric and even if you use a very heavy hand to make people live together, how do you actually reconstruct anything? And so eventually, with a great many people arrested and waiting trial for a decade, you had a system of community courts set up and called Gacaca, where you had 12,000 courts around the country, a very small country. So there was an attempt to sort of involve the community in a kind of hybrid form of accountability that combined criminal justice, but also a lot of mechanisms of reconciliation, drew on elements of Rwandan tradition, but also highly modernized and particular to the genocide context. And of course, that was a very fraught decade during which that took place. And I really started going back towards the end of that period to one of the villages that I had first visited in 1996, right as the killers were coming home from the camps, the killers in that particular hill. and continued to visit those same people and find out not only how they'd understood the accountability process, but how they understood its aftermath and what it was like to live with it in the aftermath, and what these ideas of forgiveness and coexistence actually seemed to be like for them, and how it was working out for them. And who, there was the idea that, well, the Hutu are now defeated and they're being collectively made guilty, but that's not the way it feels in the villages. They have their families. They are often thriving, especially as the fathers came home from prison. Many of their kids are getting educated for the first time, which they never did under these Hutu governments. And the survivors in the cities, it's very Tutsi in many parts, especially in Kigali. Nobody's supposed to talk about this anymore, but most people know who's who, or have some basic understanding of it. It's very different. I think the biggest divide right now is generational and rural versus urban. Hutu and Tutsi map onto that to some extent, but not entirely. And that the generational shifts have been very profound. And really just, I know that a lot of people have been using a lot more documentary. I mean, like they read, the internet has made possible all kinds of archives and all kinds of things. I really have just been interviewing people who, they have nothing written. There's no record of this place except I've dug a little bit in the Gacaca archives, which are handwritten and very incomplete. And most of it's just talking to people over time, revisiting the same people, watching their lives take shape, hearing how they tell the same or different stories differently over time. And where not always like contradictory, but where the accent falls, where the emphasis falls, what the condition is. And seeing how something that really made sense to nobody, which was the possibility that people would make it 30 years. And, you can talk about 30 years as a blink in time. And you can also think about it's the better part of a lot of people's lives. And 30 years is a long period for stability, even under a very heavy-handed regime that keeps it in place. And then there's on the hills, I'm not sure that they care about that. So when you ask, like, what do people on the hills think, or what do people think when Kabuga's arrested or something, it doesn't make much of an impression, because to them, those people are not the people that they were dealing with during the genocide. They're glad that that's happening. Good for that. It's good to know that not only the peasants are being held to account and so forth, but to them, they would often say to me, yes, those people, without them, we understand that there wouldn't have been this genocide. But the person who did it and who knew better was the person who did it to me as my neighbor and who lives in that house right there, right now, for the rest of my life. And that's the drama that is completely distinct to Rwanda. There's no other place that's got that dynamic or that has undertaken anything comparable as an ambitious attempt to have accountability afterwards. Some people have criticized them for that. Some people have praised them for that. I'm just interested in seeing what it looks like.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for sharing that. So we now have a few minutes to sort of open up the floor. I don't know if we can get the lights up slightly so I can see folks. Does anyone have any questions? Maybe we'll collect sort of 2 or 3, and then you can answer that, like those 2 or 3 questions at once.
Thanks a lot for that input. I'm curious about the aquarium as seen from here, from the global north. So there is, I think, this narrative about Rwanda now where it is performing remarkably well on a lot of economic and social development indicators compared to other countries in the region. And that story seems all the more remarkable given where the country was in 1994. But it seems to me like often the way that this story is talked about here in a country like Germany and in the States and in the global north is that this has to do with this heavy-handed regime of Paul Kagame, that in a way Rwanda has been rebuilt by a strong man. And I wonder what you make of that narrative as a story itself, but also what does it say about us as the people in the global north telling this story? Yeah.
All right. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, I was just wondering if you'd like to comment on Michaela Wrong's book, because that seems to kind of present an alternative version of the situation in Rwanda now. I mean, I'm from Britain, and a lot of people are very concerned about sending asylum seekers to a country that seems to have a pretty appalling human rights record now, and has actually been complicit in destabilizing the region, you know, other countries round about. So, thank you.
So maybe we'll take those two questions together, since they speak to one another quite well, and then we'll take one more round of questions afterwards. Please.
As you know, the perspective of the global north, there is the view that heavy hand inside Rwanda was necessary or was part of Rwanda's forward trajectory is actually one pushed forward very strongly inside Rwanda, and not only from that heavy hand. Like, you'll hear it in the villages. People will say, it was good that we weren't able to, you know, do what we wanted, but had to, you know, sort of be held into place, because otherwise we'd have had revenge and violence unlimited. I don't know whether that's how everybody feels, and maybe they say that sort of thing because they feel like that, but they don't say it in a way that's exactly the same as the government saying it. You know, sometimes I've had people say to me, well, you know, we have a dictatorship type regime here, and that actually is a lot of what's kept things from getting, kept things moving forward. You know, that's not how they talk about it in Kigali, I can tell you. What I can tell you is, I don't know whether it, how much to attribute to a heavy hand. I don't think you can subtract it out completely. I don't think you can credit it completely. Because first of all, we don't have a control. There, you know, Rwanda has never had democracy in any kind of sense that we think of it, you know, which is to say, free competitive elections. The only time they came close to opening up to multi-partyism in a free-for-all way was what led up to the genocide, and the whole. And so we don't have and it's not clear that that would have been anybody's model for the aftermath, anybody there. But more importantly, when I go to the villages and when I go to the place that I've been going back to over and over and talk to the same people over time, they very rarely refer to this, to anything central in the government. That doesn't mean it's not part of their lives, but they don't speak the exact same rhetoric. They speak something that kind of is a refraction of it at times, but you don't need to have heard all the government programs to decode the way they're understanding themselves, or vice versa. And that's also true of how the genocide happened. It was brought from above. It was licensed and authorized from above, but it was carried out by an enormous amount of local agency. And so the complicated thing is figuring out how within that agency you develop, you get somewhere towards a kind of progress. What are the incentives? What are the different ways that that works? What is considered fair? How does it work when you ask people to confess in exchange for a degree of forgiveness and a kind of plea bargaining deal? And do they end up thinking that was reasonably fair? It varies a lot locally too, because there are places where some people would complain, well, we were very hard hit by the RPF during the war and we're the only ones punished. But there are many parts of the country that were untouched by the war during that period. So it varies a lot how local experiences worked. It's a small country and it's got a very cohesive set of narratives around it, but it sure has a lot of local variation, and people live very locally. Most people live their entire lives literally in walking distance of their homes. I think it's important as a reporter to think, what does that mean? And to try to operate a little bit in response to that, and not always to look simply at like national statistics and sort of patterns that are in our heads, but try to understand how they explain it to themselves. And sometimes it can mean, and this frustrated the human rights people endlessly, that you would have survivors who were less interested in accountability in any kind of, you know, traditional human rights law sense than they were in compensation, because compensation allowed them to have the beginning of a life after. And actually, the other thing doesn't, which is where these legal systems are different. If you think about it, legal systems are not actually that interested in victims. They're interested in the law. They're interested in enforcing the law and in their own codes. And and so trying to find those differences, split those differences and find why is it this way? Is it simply because they're failing to do it our way? Or is it because there's a logic to it? And does that logic make sense to them? Are the things that they criticize the same as the things that get criticized out here? They're quite different. I don't have anything to say about a book that I haven't really read. I looked a little bit and it didn't stir a speech in me.
All right, so one last round of questions, maybe one or two questions, and then are there any more? I see one back there, yeah? All right, so quick questions and quick answers as well. I'm sorry for myself running over time.
It's okay, I try to make it quick. So in the beginning you said that before the Belgium intervenience, there was no difference actually between the Hutus and the Tutsis, like from an ethnical view. And first I would like to ask, why has there been a differentiation by names in the first place between Hutus and Tutsis and the identification? And also, what has changed with the genocide, like not only from a historical view, so this has happened to us, the genocide, but maybe have different traits, cultural traits emerged after the genocides, like different languages or festivities or something where you can differentiate the races a little bit more.
So, when I said that, I didn't say that there was no difference between them as a group. I said that they weren't really identified as ethnicities or races. I think that probably the more accurate description of them, these terms, would be some approximation of class or caste. That they represented social status, though that varied regionally. There were areas where being Hutu was to be, there were Hutu chiefs much more than in other areas. And the most conventional one is kind of the Cain and Abel one, which is that Tutsis were cattle keepers and Hutus were tillers of the soil, were peasant farmers. I mean, we would call them farmers. They say cultivateur is the French word that they all use now. And so that they planted and they were, and the Tutsis were a little bit more migratory, nomadic at least in their herdsmanship. And that these, as in any traditional society, have a whole lot of different status and kind of identities wrapped around them. And they also had started, as I said, in the mid to late 19th century to be used as kind of ideas of superior, inferior, political, social categories. But the idea of race or ethnicity as such, and to define it, to say it's the defining feature of difference, that became this European overlay and import. These things are extremely hard to unravel. In the aftermath, the official policy of the government is that these terms are virtually taboo. One doesn't speak about them. One doesn't no longer make censuses about them. They got rid of the identity cards. The idea is we are all Rwandans first and foremost. Of course, we have these historical identities. So I've heard people say to me, I am what they used to call, or I was a Tutsi, or more often it's people saying I was a Hutu, because Tutsi can say I was a Tutsi, therefore I was targeted. For the younger people, though, the people who were born since for more than a decade now has been the majority of Rwandans, I'm not sure that this is really as salient as all that. I'm not sure that it really registers that powerfully for them to really make those distinctions or to say this is my Hutu identity or my Tutsi identity. Some of the survivors certainly have it. Intermarriage, for instance, is a measure of it. And most people will tell you that you see it again, but not so much amongst the elites, not so much in the urban areas where people, and also you have a huge number of people who coming into the country from exile, specifically the Tutsi elite, who have been in the country now in the last 25, 30 years, many of whom didn't come back for 5, 10 years, many of whom, for whom it's not a place that they lived their life before. And so these identities have different meanings for all these different people. But you don't need to say Hutu and Tutsi, right? You need to, like, oh, there was a father who was in prison. There was a cousin who was in prison. There's some, this is somebody who doesn't have any living relatives. That's Tutsi. There was somebody who went to the camps. Somebody who was in Congo. Somebody who lived in, who went to school in Uganda during the before time. But those people are actually getting to be pretty old. They are the declining generation, the people in their 50s and 60s and so on. My contemporaries, and we're heading back into history now, and there's a whole different set of experiences, including the fact that although they have these identities and they may have even direct or inherited memories from childhood, they are not implicated. They are neither directly victimized, they're indirectly victimized if they had a lot of their family killed, or in any way accountable. So the nature of how those relationships to that event shift is meaningful, and so that's a very complicated new fabric there, and one that will take a long time to really become clearer.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. So I've gotten a signal that I need to bring down the hammer more or less on this particular part of the evening. So thank you very much to Philip Gourevitch for joining us this evening. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you all.
Thank you all for coming. So there are a lot of compelling accounts on this topic. I've tried to mention a lot of them throughout. There are many more. If you're interested in sort of narrowly in the topic of German foreign policy before and during the genocide, I think there are some copies of the study that Sarah Bockmeier and I wrote for the Heinrich Böll Foundation in 2021. So thanks a lot again for stopping by. Enjoy the rest of the evening and the rest of the festival as well. Thanks a lot. And thanks, Philip.
Thank you all.